Great. Welcome to LiFT Week 6. Can you believe it? We are 6 weeks in, which is amazing. Let's say good evening, first of all, to Dinsdale. Dinsdale, are you with us? Okay, Dinsdale, I think your screen is possibly showing black. So I'm not sure if you can see us or hear us, but hello. Tokoroa, good evening, Tokoroa. Excellent. Awesome. And good evening, Waihi. We can see you there. Excellent. Good evening, Harborough. Vincent and Kath, are you there? Awesome. Kia ora. And Morrinsville. Good evening, Morrinsville. Excellent. Good to see you. And good evening, New Plymouth. Up there, we can see you. Brilliant. And Taumarunui. Good evening to Taumarunui. Oh, good. Oh, Dinsdale. Dinsdale, we can see you now. Excellent. We can see you waving heartily. Brilliant. And good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, or whenever you're doing it, to our groups that are doing it not on a Tuesday. So we'll say hello to the group at Hamilton Cathedral, to the group in New Plymouth, to the group in Raglan, the group in Tikawiti, to Susanna and Kafia, to Hawara and to Te Aroha. Welcome everybody to week 6 of LiFT. Before we start this evening, I've just got a couple of notices to give. Wouldn't be a sort of churchy thing without notices. And do you give the notices at the beginning or the end? And I thought, well, I'll do them at the beginning, otherwise I might forget. So the first thing is, most importantly, don't forget that there's no session next week. Okay, so there's no LiFT next week, which is partly motivated by the fact that the Lions are playing the Chiefs in Hamilton, and I figured some people might want to be involved with that. So we are not meeting next week. Okay, and the second thing to say is that the first session of Block 2. Okay, so the first week that we're back, which I think is August the 1st, but for that first session, what we're going to do is that we're going to have a bit of a Q&A time. So the idea is that if you've had any questions that have sort of bubbled up about the material over Block 1, burning questions that you think, I want to ask the bishop that question, put her on the spot. The idea is that we're going to collect those questions in, or I can see some people rubbing their hands. Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, Morrinsville. I won't answer any questions from Morrinsville. The idea is we're going to collect those questions in, and I'm basically going to pull them out of a hat, so to speak, or a mitre, or something like that. The mitre might be appropriate, and give it a go. Okay, so that's so there'll be a bit more information about that coming out in the next few weeks. I think basically we're going to ask your local coordinator to collect some questions and to send those in to Stephen, and then we'll make sure that I'll try and answer those questions on the night. This was my idea, by the way, and now I'm beginning to regret it. But anyway, I think it's kind of important to give you the opportunity to ask questions about the material, which will be great, she said confidently. Anyway, on to tonight. Last week, the last 2 weeks actually have been, we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? We magnificently covered the whole Old Testament in an hour and a half. That was epic. And then last week we managed to cover all of the Gospels and a little hint of the Book of Acts as well. So tonight we're shifting gear a little bit into another part of the New Testament, and we're going to spend some time looking at the letters, or particularly one of the letters, and that is 1 Corinthians. And then before we do that, we're going to spend a bit of time thinking about the Apostle Paul, who's a pretty key person when it comes to the life of the early church, and particularly the development of Christianity. But before we get to that, we'll do what we usually do, and that is give you a chance in your local groups to reflect on the material from last week and to discuss what has bubbled to the surface for you about the material we looked at last week, about the Gospels in particular. Is there anything that's stood out for you during the week? Anything that you've noticed perhaps on Sunday morning? Perhaps you took notice of the Gospel that was read in a particular way. Anything that stood out for you during the week. So we'll give ourselves some time, 10 minutes or so, to discuss that. All right, I'll check back with you in a little while. Everybody, let's take a plunge into the letters. Now, obviously, when you open your New Testament and you've finished reading the Gospels, you will immediately come upon the letter of Paul to the Romans, and thereafter there are a whole series of letters. And I guess the thing is that nowadays we don't often write letters. I don't know how many of you ever write a letter in the sense of a handwritten letter. But it's always quite nice to get a letter through the post, isn't it? Or a car or something like that. Because we're so used to nowadays using other forms of communication, particularly email. And one of the slightly difficult things about that form of communication is that there aren't, people sort of dispense with formalities often in email. You know, you might just get a sort of question barked at you, so to speak, or a one-line comment or a one-word comment. Emails are not a particularly poetic form of communication. So we've sort of, in some ways, in our society today, almost lost the art of letter writing. And obviously, in the ancient world, they didn't send emails. No, that's right. Didn't they? No, some people are quite surprised here in Sean Brown House that there was no email technology in the ancient world, but I can confirm that as yet we have not discovered any first century computers. So what we've got are letters. So kind of letters went to and fro, really. And usually when you wrote a letter, there'd be a kind of a style for writing a letter. And Paul's letters pretty much follow that convention, with some exceptions, which I'll say a little bit about when we run through all of the letters just now. But you're basically dealing with a form of communication that, would take a little while. You can send an email and it goes instantly. When you send a letter in the ancient world, you're going to have to wait a little bit for a reply. And one of the things, of course, about the letters in the New Testament is that we don't have, by and large, a sense of ongoing correspondence. We don't have we pretty much don't have the letters that people wrote back to Paul, or perhaps the questions that they had. We've got some hints about that in Paul's letters, but we don't have any embedded replies to Paul with a sense of ongoing communication. So for us, reading those letters in the New Testament, we have to really bear in mind that they are letters, okay? That they're not the Gospels. They are, in a sense, one part of communication, and they're Paul's, by and large, aspect of communication. So we need to bear some things in mind when we are reading Paul's letters. The genre is really important. We are dealing with letters. And in fact, of course, most of the New Testament is taken up with letters. So let's just have a quick run through all of the letters. Romans is the first one that you'll find. And again, a bit like with the Gospels, the order of the letters in the New Testament doesn't necessarily mean that they're the order in which they were written. Probably the reasons why Romans is the first letter is that it's the longest. So you kind of put the weighty letter in there first of all. But Romans was probably not the first letter that Paul wrote. In fact, Romans was probably the last letter that we have from Paul. But anyway, Romans is a kind of a weighty text. It contains quite a lot of probing theology, quite a lot of Paul's deepest reflections on his faith. And that's one of the reasons why we know Romans was a later letter, because it's almost like Paul is reaching the end of his life and his journey as a believer, and he's kind of summing everything up and reflecting on some pretty big topics. So we get some extended conversation about the law, for example. What is the meaning of the Jewish law? How do we follow it? And there's 3 chapters on the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. So there's some really big topics covered in Romans. But if you were to read Romans as your first Pauline letter, you might think, oh my goodness, this is quite heavy going. So be warned when you have a look at Romans. There's a lot going on it. Next up we have 1 and 2 Corinthians, and we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about 1 Corinthians this evening. And they're kind of really good examples of general letters dealing with various issues. And the Corinthian church was clearly a church that was experiencing some challenging times. One of the reasons why I think 1 Corinthians in particular is such an interesting letter to read is that it feels very contemporary. When you read it, you can kind of imagine yourself in Corinth as part of that community. We think that we have a lot of challenges that we face today in our church context, but boy, did those Corinthians have challenges. So I kind of find that slightly reassuring, also a little bit depressing, because you think, gosh, nothing's changed. But of course it has. But the fact is, if you read 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, you get a really good sense of some of the issues that the early church faced. There are some particular challenges in 2 Corinthians with the way that letter is put together. So scholars think that 2 Corinthians actually might be made up of more than one letter. Some of the ways in which the manuscripts are put together suggests that there's some interesting editing that has gone on, that we've got combinations of different letters that have been put together to form what we have as 2 Corinthians. Galatians is up next, and Galatians is the one letter in Paul's corpus, body writing of letters, that does not follow conventions. So if you look at Paul's letters, you usually get some kind of greeting at the start, and Paul will say, grace and peace to you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, etc. And he'll maybe greet a few people, and then he'll kind of move on to the body of the letter. And then he'll sort of finish the letter by saying more greetings. So that's a kind of standard way in which Paul does his letters. Galatians dispenses with all of those conventions, and that's because with the Galatian community, Paul is really quite angry. Okay, he does not like the Galatians. He is quite annoyed with them because they are not behaving very well. So he kind of dispenses with all the usual greetings. He just goes straight in to the body of the text. And, he pretty much says to them, oh, foolish Galatians. I mean, it's, yes. As a bishop, I get all sorts of letters written to me, and quite a number of them, I'd say, are of the Galatian variety, shall we say. So I'll just put the word out there. If anybody wants to send me a nice letter, that would be awesome. Anyway, there we go. But the fact is, thanks Morrinsville. But the fact is, with Galatians, Paul's really quite irate, and you just have to read it to get a sense of that. But also, of course, fundamentally, to get a sense that Paul is annoyed, but he still loves the Galatians. He still believes that they are fundamentally part of the body of Christ. It's just that they've kind of gone off-piste a little bit, to use a skiing image. So he just gets straight in there and goes for it. Ephesians, again, is another really good example of a letter that kind of just reflects on the big picture of God's plan. That's worth a look at. Ephesians and Colossians, if you remember a few weeks ago when we looked generally at the New Testament, are two of the letters that Some people are not entirely sure if Paul wrote them or not. I'm inclined to think that he probably did write them, but there is a debate in scholarship about whether Paul wrote them, and that has to do particularly with the use of the language in those letters. If you analyse the Greek, there's some parts of those letters that don't seem to be Paul's usual style. But anyway, Ephesians is a good general letter, as is Philippians. There'll be parts of Philippians that you'll be really familiar with. That passage in where Paul talks about Jesus kind of stooping down and coming up, and being servant of all is often used. And that's a really good way in which Paul talks about the incarnation. It's a really good image, actually, that in Jesus God came down to human level in order that we all might be raised up together. I once heard a Sri Lankan bishop talk quite passionately about that passage in Philippians, and he used the image of greeting his granddaughter, I think it was, how his granddaughter, who was quite tiny, I think, ran towards him, and in order to kind of lift her up, he had to sort of stoop down and scoop her up, and they sort of came up together. And I thought that was a really quite a lovely image of what that powerful, those verses that Paul gives us in Philippians is about. Kind of humanises it almost, which is really helpful. But Philippians stresses Jesus' role as a servant. Colossians, a bit like Ephesians, gives some big picture views about Jesus, and Colossians particularly stresses Jesus' divinity. 1 and 2 Timothy are letters that are sometimes called pastoral letters, mainly because they're about giving advice. So they're about giving advice to Paul's pupil, who is not surprisingly called Timothy. So they're letters that have got lots of bits of information about how the early church should function. Again, you might remember 1, 2 Timothy and Titus are probably quite late letters, and they kind of fall within the Pauline school of letter writing, but they're probably not by Paul. They're by somebody who is in Paul's school of thought, but they're probably not by Paul himself, because the language and the style are very different to the letters that are considered to be Pauline. 1 and 2 Thessalonians focus really on a church that had sort of slightly got it wrong about the second coming. And one of the main issues with the Thessalonians is that they appeared to think that, well, because Jesus might be coming back this week, why bother? So they'd kind of just given up, really. They were basically having a nice time, not really doing anything, because they thought there's no point because Jesus is coming back. So Paul kind of had to write to them to give them the proverbial prod, really, to say, look, hang on a minute, that's not quite how it works. Yes, Jesus is coming back, but you've still got to be active and do things. Don't be complacent, don't give up. So that's what's going on in Thessalonians. Titus, a bit like 1 and 2 Timothy, gives us lots of information about how to run the church. Philemon, or Philemon, different ways of pronouncing that. I'm a Philemon person myself. You may have a different pronunciation. That is a really good letter because it's very short. So if you want to impress your friends and say, I've memorised an entire biblical book, you could, in theory, memorise Philemon. Give that a go sometime. But anyway, it's very short. And it addresses the problem of a slave that has run away. Now, the interesting thing with Philemon, of course, is that Paul doesn't particularly condemn slavery as an institution. He doesn't say, no, it's wrong. And that's quite interesting, actually, from a point of view of how the church responds to issues. Paul was aware, obviously, that slavery was an institution in his context. It was part of ancient society. He doesn't condemn it outright, but he does seem to suggest that the slave, whose name is Onesimus, which is a word that means useful in Greek. That's basically what Onesimus was. He was useful. That was his name. But anyway, Paul seems to suggest that he needs to be treated well, so that's a positive. Hebrews, I've already suggested to you that might not be a letter because it reads a bit like a sermon, so we need to be mindful of that. But Hebrews particularly compares Jesus with Old Testament Hebrew religion. That's worth a read from the point of view of how that author navigates the worlds of Judaism and Christianity, kind of weaving them together in a really creative way. The letter of James is about practical Christian living. I think James was the letter that Luther said it's an epistle of straw. Luther wasn't a big fan of James, the letter. No offence if your name is James. We've got a James here in Charlotte Brown House, and my dad is called James, indeed, so I can't possibly be against the name James. But Luther didn't really like the letter of James. But anyway, it's part of our canon. I think Luther was a bit kind of, well, why is it in the Bible? But it is, so there. 1 Peter is a letter that encourages Christians who are being persecuted. 2 Peter is a letter that warns particularly about false teaching. 1, 2 and 3 John are small letters, quite short letters, and they're sort of in the Johannine school of thought, really, basically asking Christians to love each other and to resist false teaching. And then the letter of Jude is a letter that warns against heresy. Now, you probably spent most of your time, I suspect, if you're familiar with any of the letters, with the Pauline letters. Again, I'll ask you this question to think about. You may not have heard too many sermons preached on Jude, for example, or the letter of James. Now, they don't crop up in the lectionary that often, actually, not on a Sunday anyway, but they are in our New Testament and they do form part of our story. So it may be worth, if you've got some time, to have a look at some of those lesser-known letters to see what's going on there. So basically, if you took all the letters as a whole, they seem to be talking about issues that the early church faced, some of the challenges and the problems that the early church had to endure, and issues of faith, of understanding who is Jesus, how do we live together, what does key parts of our faith mean. All those kind of issues come up in the letters. They're full of details about real people and real situations. You know, there are lots of names of people that in the letters, and lots of situations that are real situations. So again, that's, I think, why they make for fascinating reading. And also I think they can offer us something helpful today, to reflect on some of the challenges that the early church faced. How are we so different from them? In fact, it, I think, connects us with them in a really quite powerful way. But as I said at the start of this little section, we do need to think really quite carefully about what letters are and what they are not, and what are some of the things that we need to bear in mind when we are encountering one of the New Testament letters. What sort of difficulties, perhaps, or challenges or opportunities are there for us in using the letters as foundational documents for our faith? Okay, so in a number of church debates and discussions, contemporary church debates and discussions, Paul's letters will be quoted frequently. Okay, but what does it mean for us to actually think, well, they are letters? How does that help or hinder us in our quest for meaning today? So spend a bit of time in your local groups just thinking about the letters as a medium of communication. How are they different from the Gospels, and how is that going to impact the way we understand our faith? Okay, so talk around those issues for a few minutes and I'll be back with you shortly. Everybody, hope you had a good discussion about the letters. We, I think, concluded here, amongst other things, that the word context is really important when it comes to thinking about the letters. So whenever you, I guess, you hear a letter read as part of the lectionary on a Sunday, ask yourself some questions about the context. Okay, so where is this from? What letter is it from? What's going on? And the fact that this is a letter, we need to be cautious of what sort of document we're dealing with. Now let's turn our attention a little bit to focusing on the person of Paul. St. Paul, obviously a pretty key character in the life of the early church, and often quoted in all sorts of discussions and debates. Paul is often kind of elevated to an almost godlike status sometimes, and sometimes I ask the question, well, you know, who was Paul? Do we really understand who Paul is? Do we like Paul, or are we not very sure? When I was a student, I was not a particular fan of Paul, I have to confess. I was much more of a quest for the historical Jesus kind of student when I was studying theology originally, and the idea of studying Paul was something that was just so way off my radar. But then I ended up doing a PhD on Paul for some really strange reason. So I spent 4 years of my life labouring with Paul, looking at the way in which he uses the imagery of work, of manual work in his letters. So I spent a lot of time thinking about tense, not as in the past tense or the future tense, but actually literal tents, you know, the canvas variety, or whatever it was that Paul was working with as a tent maker, but I'll say a little bit more about that a bit later. But I think for me at least, having an appreciation and an understanding of Paul actually really transformed my view of him, away from a kind of slight scepticism and fear and dislike of some of what he says, or apparently says, to a healthy respect and admiration for his passion and commitment, and for the way in which his life was completely transformed by Jesus Christ, and how that caused him to reframe everything about his life. I mean, one of the things that I sometimes have wrestled with, for example, is Paul's attitude towards women. It can be said that Paul doesn't exhibit a very positive attitude towards women, but often the thing is, and this is a really key point actually, is that it's not so much what Paul says or doesn't say, but it's how Paul is interpreted and used. Okay, so you need to be on the watch out really for how people are using Paul to prop up particular agendas. And in fact, Paul has some really positive things to say about women. So much so that there was, in fact, in the early church, a whole tradition of calling Paul our mother, which was quite radical. There's a prayer from the early church which talks about our mother, St. Paul, and praises Paul for his maternal attitudes and instincts, which is probably not the sort of theme that leaps to mind when you think about Paul. And there's an apocryphal account of Paul's martyrdom. We don't have any indication in the New Testament of how Paul met his death, but the tradition is that Paul was martyred in Rome. And in this document that reports to tell us about his death, right at the end of the story, when the executioner's sword strikes Paul and he dies, it's not blood that comes out of his body, but apparently milk, which is a really pretty powerful maternal image. And so there was in the early church a tradition of a more feminine side of Paul, which for whatever reason was suppressed and kind of eradicated. So Paul was kind of turned into this anti-feminist whatever, but he's not necessarily. But anyway, this quote you've got in the box, page 23, says something quite important. It says, "Few figures in Western history have been the subject of greater controversy than St. Paul. Few have caused more dissension and hatred. None has suffered more misunderstanding at the hands of both friends and enemies. None has produced more animosity between Jews and Christians." Okay, so Paul as a character has been quite a divisive figure in some ways, but it's often the way Paul is understood and misunderstood that has caused a lot of the difficulties. Now, that account that I told you about a minute ago about how Paul met his death also gives us an account of what Paul looked like. And here we go. This comes from the Acts of Paul and Thecla. He saw Paul coming, a man small of stature, with a bald head and crooked legs, in a good state of body, with eyebrows meeting and nose somewhat hooked, full of friendliness. For now he appeared like a man, and now he had the face of an angel. That's quite interesting, isn't it? Possibly not the sort of person that at first glance you would think very attractive or charismatic, but there was something in him that was charismatic nonetheless. And in 2 Corinthians, we have this interesting reference to Paul, that his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech contemptible. Okay. So that's interesting, isn't it? But there is something about his letters, and that's true because that's obviously what we've got access to. There's something in his letters that suggests that there is a strength and a charisma there. Now, Paul was, by all accounts, a bit of a radical, and one of the reasons that we know this is that if you look at the start of Romans, you have this really bold proclamation that Paul makes about the gospel of God concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh and was declared to be Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness by resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. That's kind of how Paul starts this, pièce de résistance of his letter writing. But the way Paul describes the gospel there is very similar to how, for example, the Roman emperor would be lauded and praised. And what Paul's doing here basically is saying to people in the know, particularly in Rome, because the might of the Roman Empire was all around them, is actually it's not the emperor who is God. There's this other God who is the God, the only God, manifested through Jesus Christ. So Paul, in kind of putting it out there in his letter, is doing something very politically subversive and quite a risky thing to do. So never underestimate that, actually, when you read some of Pauline's letters, just how politically subversive they are. We can take that kind of opening for granted, I think, because we're used to talking about Jesus Christ in such terms. But Paul's talking into a context where the Roman emperor is God. Okay? Paul is saying none of that matters. None of that matters. Jesus Christ is the person that matters. So what do you suppose would be the effect on people who were used to being told that the emperor alone was a divine being to be worshipped? So Paul's radical. There's also some aspects of Paul's letters that we might think, I'm not really sure what's going on there. So it's almost like Paul is, confused might be a little bit too harsh, but it's almost like Paul is, when you do that thing of thinking out loud, you kind of have a train of thought that might not quite make sense at the time. Well, if you look at this passage again from Romans chapter 7, that's quite a good example of that. If you say it really quickly, it has even more of an impact. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. But in fact, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. Gosh. If you say it really, really, really quickly, like I said, you end up in all sorts of tongue-twisting challenges. But that's a really good example of Paul kind of thinking out loud. And that's one of the reasons why I find Paul actually quite appealing, that he has this capacity to do his theology on the go kind of thing. You know, he writes such beautiful language at times, and yet there's also this really kind of earthy grittiness to his theology, which is theology being worked out in the moment. And I think that that's an encouragement to us as a church to actually struggle and wrestle a little bit with theology in the here and now. You know, each one of us, each one of you, all of us, we are doing theology. We are all theologians. We're all trying to figure out what this faith thing means for us at this time in our place. So, who is Paul? Well, Paul says, again, in Romans chapter 11, he gives us some kind of autobiographical hints about who he is. Now I am speaking to you, Gentiles, since I am apostle to the Gentiles. So Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. That's, I guess, one of the most, if not the most important part of who Paul was, that he was commissioned to be apostle to the Gentiles. That was God's plan for Paul. And we know this because, obviously, his life was transformed by an experience that he had with the risen Christ. So he went from being persecutor to believer. And through that was made apostle to the Gentiles. But at the same time, Paul remained thoroughly Jewish. So sometimes we do talk about what happened to Paul on the Damascus Road as a conversion. And I think it's appropriate to use that word, but it's also appropriate to think about that as a calling, a kind of vocation. It was a new life that Paul had to follow, somebody who was for Christ rather than against Christ. But in all of that, Paul remains proudly Jewish, and he tells us this on a number of occasions. In Philippians, he says, "If any other man thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law a Pharisee, as to zeal a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law blameless." Okay, so that's an important point too, that Paul saw himself as being Jewish. He stayed Jewish. Okay? He was not the first Christian. He was a believer in Jesus Christ, but his identity was very firmly as a Jew. Even though Paul was an apostle, he was aware that other people didn't really think of him as having especially high status. He says to us in 1 Corinthians 15, "For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God," Paul's pretty big on grace, "I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them." So Paul's often quite keen to tell us how hard he worked, which is a very human kind of emotion. I worked really hard, harder than any of those people. And in fact, there's one part in his letters, where he talks about being shipwrecked and all sorts of kind of crazy trials that he's gone through, like some kind of extreme reality TV show that Paul has endured everything and come out the other side intact. So there are some, I think, really human elements to Paul's letters, and again, that's why I find Paul quite an appealing character, because his humanity comes out so much. In fact, the more you read Paul's letters, the more you kind of get to know him as a human being, and get to know his ways, and I find that quite interesting. We know that Paul, of course, was born with the name Saul in Tarsus in Cilicia, which is modern-day Turkey. And in all his letters, Paul uses the name Paulos, which is a Roman name, which would be usual for a Roman citizen. So in Acts, Paul's introduced as Saul, which is a Jewish name, and then only in Acts 13 do we read, in fact, that he's also called Paul, which is his Roman name, because Paul, as well as being Jewish, he's also a Roman citizen. And that's another key thing about Paul's life as well. And it's thought that the change in name probably has to do with Paul moving in predominantly non-Jewish circles. So you get some examples of this elsewhere in the New Testament. Peter CFAS, for example. So that's an example of that. Now, we know that Paul was educated. Acts 22 suggests that Paul was educated either in Tarsus or Jerusalem, or maybe Jerusalem alone. But from his letters, it seems that Paul's had a Jewish education, and that the way Paul debates and discusses issues seems to reflect a rabbinic training rather than a classical Greek education. But Paul, I think, in many ways was a citizen of the world, his world being the world of the Roman Empire, a world that was quite complex, a world in which some scholars have called was a world full of gods. Paul knew that world really well. He knew its cultural complexity, and he was able to navigate that with a clarity about the importance of Jesus Christ in the midst of all of that. So there are some parts of his letters where you can see that he's riffing off kind of Greek ideas, which is quite interesting too, and it tells us a lot today actually about how we present Christianity in another world full of gods, in a society that's quite secular. I'm talking about our own society, a society where there are all sorts of competing attractive things on show. It's quite useful to think about, well, in fact, we'll do this at the end of this evening. What would Paul say if he was going to write St. Paul's letter to Morrinsville? What would Paul say if he was going to write St. Paul's letter to Taumarunui? And so on and so forth. What are the things that Paul would identify in your context that you need to think about? We've already seen in that quote from Philippians that Paul sees himself as a Pharisee. So the Pharisees are a Jewish group that have particular passion for the law, and Paul was particularly passionate about the Jewish law. We know that from his letters, but he's also in many ways conflicted about the law. So he has the highest regard for it, yet at the same time he acknowledges that Jesus Christ surpasses the law. So he really wrestles with what the place of the law is. And again, that's another reason why I think he's quite appealing, that you can kind of feel his pain as he's trying to work all of these issues out. And then, as I've said earlier, if anybody's interested, you're welcome to read my PhD thesis, which looks at Paul's trade as a tent maker. That was the thing that he used to support himself financially, if you like. We know that from 1 Corinthians 18, where he teams up with a tent-making couple, Prisca and Aquila, and goes into business with them. Tent-making would have been for Paul a pretty portable trade. He could have carried his tools around, mended people's tents, and probably witnessed to the gospel while they waited for Paul to fix their tent. It was particularly effective in a context like Corinthians, where there were some, well, not the Olympic Games, but there were some big games going on, and there would have been a lot of tents for Paul to fix. But the point is that Paul uses his trade as a means to support himself, so that he doesn't have to rely on the churches to support him, and he also uses it as an illustration of how God is active in the world, working, and Paul was able through that to evangelise, probably to who Jesus was. So perhaps you could spend a few minutes in your groups now, just kind of thinking about, well, what do you think about Paul? Okay. Maybe you've spent time before tonight thinking about Paul, maybe not, but do you have any views on Paul? And what are those views? And maybe has anything that I've shared with you in the last little while, has that backed up those views, or has it sort of challenged them, or anything really? What do you think about Paul? Okay, so have a bit of a discussion about Paul, and I'll check back with you in a few minutes, and we'll look at 1 Corinthians. Thanks for your attention this evening. Hopefully you might have some time this coming week to keep doing your journal, but maybe to reflect a little bit more on Paul, maybe have a look at one of his letters, have a look at 1 Corinthians if you can. Have a look at 1 Corinthians 15 actually and read that beautiful reflection on the resurrection. Next week, no session, remember? No session next week, so 2 weeks tonight. That's when we gather back together. We will be looking at the very cheerful text of the book of Revelation and hopefully uncover some things about that tricky text that will inspire you. So no session next week, so you've got a bit more time to do some reflecting, and we will be back together in 2 weeks' time to look at Revelation. So first of all, I'm going to say good night to all the people who are doing the course offline. So goodbye to all of you folk. Thank you for your engagement and your discussions this evening, and we'll see you again soon.